Naguib and the younger general Gamal Abdel Nasser. This is in the 1950s, I should say. The newspaper, which I sometimes borrowed from my father's office when he wasn't there, reported regularly about arrests of criminals or enemies of the government, some of whom had recently held important state positions. I surmised from the nervous, bad mood that my father lately projected at the dinner table that he was anxious about his position and didn't know who to trust or follow. I worried that my betrothal was related to his political maneuvering. "How old is he?" I responded when my father shared the news of my engagement with me and my mother over supper. "What does it matter?" my father replied, which I took as a bad sign. "Don't you care at all about my happiness?" I asked, looking from my father, who sat at the head of the table, to my mother, who sat across from me. We occupied one end of a table that accommodated 10, forever dining in the presence of a horseshoe of vacant chairs. It felt like a metaphor for our existence, everything in abundance. Meanwhile, Rima and Abdu Abdullah dined on lukewarm leftovers at a flimsy card table in the kitchen after all their work was done. Suddenly, everything about my life felt wrong. "Don't be childish," my mother scolded from across the table, setting her fork down loudly on her plate. "It's not like you can go on living here forever." She glanced at my father in a way that was more shrewd than intimate. "Your father has very high standards, and I'm sure that the man he's picked for you," she paused to think, narrowing her eyes at me, "meets all of his rigid qualifications." It sickened me to think of myself as my father's bargaining chip, as a resource that others wanted and he would offer to the most attractive bidder. I felt my childhood coming to an end like a noose tightening around my neck. The girls I'd known from school who'd left and gotten married were a keen object of gossip among those of us who were left behind. A couple of them immediately started having babies and were now mothers of multiple children. Another went off to live with her new husband in Kuwait. Once I ran into a classmate at the Gezira Club who complained of having gone into marriage ignorant of the fact that her husband was a widow and already had 3 older kids who lived with them. "You can't make me do it," I shouted at my parents standing from the table. Feeling myself on the edge of tears, I rushed out of the room. The murmur of my parents' bafflement followed me. When my father's gathering with his old army buddies came around the next month, I was determined to run into Khalil and test my theory that maybe we'd fallen in love at first sight. We hadn't spoken more than a few words to one another, but in my head we'd had 100 conversations. His figment self, like me, was struck by the power of our meeting and also a believer in the mysterious hand of fate. I needed to think that we were meant to come together because I wanted to imagine a future where I could be happy. Rima liked to be alone when she cleaned the kitchen after dinner, so it annoyed her when I chose to park myself there to keep track of the comings and goings from my father's office. "Don't you have something else to do?" she asked, unusually stern. When I picked up a cup she'd just washed to try and dry it, she grew even angrier. "What are you doing? Sit down." She took the cup from my hand and set it back on the towel with the other damp dishes, widening her eyes at me as if I'd made a grievous breach. I moved away from the sink, feeling chastened, and at the same time heard the door to my father's office open. Well timed with Rima's rejection, I had an excuse to flee the kitchen without ceremony. "Wait," she called at my back. "I'm sorry." When I came out to the hallway, I found Khalil standing there looking around as if he wasn't sure where to go. "Were you looking for me?" I asked in a high, nervous whisper. Even in the dim light of the hallway, I could see him blushing. "Yes," he stammered. "Here I am," I announced with breathless confidence. "Can we go somewhere else and talk for a minute?" Khalil asked in an urgent whisper. "Yes," I told him, and then proceeded to think of where. We couldn't go out to the front lawn and risk being spotted by someone arriving or leaving the house, and we certainly couldn't go upstairs in the proximity of bedrooms. So I decided to lead us out to the backyard, a manicured, well-tended landscape of palm and lemon and date trees that seldom saw use by my family. It was either the heat and the mosquitoes that kept us away, or else the feeling of being watched by the new neighbors who kept popping up all around our property, and the multi-story apartment buildings that had risen up from the lots surrounding ours in recent years. I don't think we should sit down, I told Khalil as we stood on the Moroccan-tiled veranda. There was a glass-topped table surrounded by chairs near the back door, but instead I steered us toward the small grove of trees clustered across the yard. I stopped beneath the lemon tree that had long supplied the fruit for Rima's delicious lemonade. Khalil stood a respectful distance away, further than my arms could reach. "Are you okay?" he asked me suddenly, his expression registering alarm. I touched my face as if this could help me detect the way I looked to him. I felt my pulse racing, my body hot. "Yes," I said, widening my eyes further. "I was waiting for you," I told him impulsively, compelled by the rush of confidence I experienced then. My thrill at the divinity I thought was intervening in my favor. "You were?" Khalil asked incredulously, wrinkling his brow. "Weren't you looking for me too?" I asked him in return. He smiled and dropped his gaze to the ground. "You see," I said, feeling that the evidence was so clear. I thought my fate was going to be this different, terrible thing, but now I see what God had planned for me all along. "Yes," Khalil repeated, more uncertain this time. "Are you talking about us? Me and you?" I smiled, charmed by his modesty and innocence. "What else?" I asked. "But you're the general's daughter," Khalil responded, stating the obvious. I knew what he meant, but was annoyed by the suggestion that he wasn't good enough for me. "So what?" I challenged. "Maybe God isn't classist the way that those of us on Earth are." Khalil muffled a laugh. "What's a nice girl like you doing concerning yourself with the issues of society?" I felt ridiculed but not deterred. "Just because I'm rich doesn't mean I'm stupid," I told him, matter-of-factly. "No, of course not," Khalil said in a rush, stepping closer to me. I could smell coffee on his breath as he exhaled loudly a few times with his mouth open. I couldn't imagine that this was just ordinary attraction. It felt transcendent, like it could lift me up and take me to another place. How could it work, Khalil wondered. We keep meeting up like this once a month until we're old and gray and agree never to marry other people? A smile crept across his lips. I loved him more by the moment. Or we could run away together, I suggested. His smile vanished and he stared at me openly, without obvious emotion. "Are you serious?" he asked. "Yes," I said. Khalil inhaled sharply and his eyelids shuddered as if he were about to sneeze or cry. He reached out with his hands like he was going to grab me and then turned them into fists and brought them up to his mouth. "I might have an opportunity," he said after a few fraught seconds. "I've applied for a scholarship to study in New York and I should hear soon if I got it." All at once I could picture it. Khalil and I strolling down New York City's clean, modern boulevards, which I knew from American movies my father and I watched at the cinema. Most of the American imports we saw were romances, so the story of me and Khalil fleeing to New York together in the name of love fit along with these narratives perfectly. "I'd love to go with you," I told him joyously. We moved toward one another and somehow ended up in each other's arms. I could feel the heat from his body and couldn't tell whose heartbeat was making my chest thud, mine or his. When he leaned in to kiss me, it was like all of the lights went off. I couldn't see anything. Maybe my eyes were closed. My entire consciousness centered on the sensation of his mouth pressing against mine. We planned to meet in the backyard again at 8:30 when my father next had his compatriots over. Much to my relief, negotiations appeared to have stalled with the man my father wanted me to marry. In the meantime, I couldn't sleep, and when I did, I often dropped into feverish dreams and woke up drenched in sweat, feeling even more exhausted. "You're acting strange," Rima remarked one night when she came up to check on me. I felt conflicted. On the one hand, I wanted to invite Rima into my confidence, but on the other, I felt compelled to keep my secret to myself. She would inevitably suffer as a result of my disappearance, and I felt guilty about that in advance. Let's skip ahead and read one last scene. The next month was a torture, days and weeks of waiting and worrying that something would go wrong to thwart our plan. I was glad that school was out for the summer, so I could stay in my room. Eventually, Rima would come up to check on me, worried when I hadn't gone down for breakfast. One morning, she brought up a hot mug of sweetened tea and milk and a cellophane roll of my favorite imported cookies. She sat down on the edge of the bed and encouraged me to eat. "What's wrong?" she implored, narrowing her eyes at me like she knew I was keeping something from her. "You know you can tell me no matter what it is." I shook my head and looked away, tears stinging my eyes. Lifting the mug from the silver tray, I brought it up to my face and hid behind its rising steam. "Do you want me to leave?" Rima asked, holding her round at the edge of the bed. I nodded between taking tiny sips of tea. She sighed and stood up. "Whatever you want, madame," she said coolly, adding an ironic head bow. She didn't come back to my room after that, and for the next couple of weeks our relationship consisted mostly of eye contact as she delivered food and drinks to my family's supper table, the only meal I was required to make an appearance at and therefore ate. Otherwise, I kept to myself in my room. A few times in the middle of the night, I woke up extremely hungry and went down to raid the kitchen, happy to have it to myself. My parents didn't seem to suspect anything, but that wasn't surprising. Over supper, my father worried over the administration's eagerness to start up another war with Israel, or about tensions at the office, all-out brawls sometimes, while my mother reported on her recent and upcoming social and beauty engagements, and I said nothing. When alone in my room, I clandestinely packed a bag for New York, which I kept hidden at the back of my closet. Khalil said it would be best if we traveled light. Confronted with having to make difficult decisions about my beloved wardrobe, I felt wistful about all that I'd have to leave behind. Khalil's words continued to ring in my head like a warning. We'll have to live modestly. I cried as I stood in front of the long row of dresses hanging in my closet, most of them tailored by a seamstress in old Cairo, whom my mother entrusted to make all of our clothes. I had no idea what I was giving up, no real sense of life, what life would be like on the other side. That's it. Thank you.